Hi guys, welcome to Theology Explained. I'm Jem. Today we're going to be talking about the context and the world that Jesus came into. So we're going to be looking at... we're going to do history. We are going to be looking at the temple. And I've selected the temple for three reasons. One, it's the place where Passover was celebrated. Two, it's the place where the Israelites, the Jews, or the Hebrew people, whatever term you want to use, were cleansed of their sin. And the third point is that it represents God dwelling with his people. Before we kick off the video, I think it's important to do a bit of history. So there were two temples. The first temple was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. And then in the same century, King Cyrus, a Babylonian king, set the Israelites free from Babylonian rule and then built the temple again. And this one was much more grand. This one survived for about 500 years. It lasted till, or I guess over that, it lasted till 70 AD. And we call this time period of 517 BC, that's when it was finished, to 70 AD, the Second Temple period. So if we go back to that first point and we look at Passover, it's really important to say and ask, well, what actually is Passover? It's a story that's described in the first half of Exodus, and it is the celebration of that story. We get the famous story of Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh, and Moses saying, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh just saying no, pretty much, or he'll barter with it or not and go back and forth. But the important thing is the celebration of the story. So we know that the Jews are going to get set free, but how do they get set free? It happens through a series of plagues. Sadly, it's quite tragic, but there are 9 plagues, and then the 10th plague is gonna come. And Moses says to the Pharaoh, he says, "There's been 9 plagues, let my people go." Still, Pharaoh doesn't let his people go. And so the 10th plague comes, and the 10th plague is absolutely brutal. It is the death of the oldest born son in the household. But God offers this condition. He says, if you sacrifice a lamb and paint the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and the lintels, then that spirit of death will pass over your home. And sadly, it will enter the homes of those who don't. So Moses tells the Israelites and the Hebrews to sacrifice a lamb and paint the blood on the doorposts and the lintels, and they do that, and the spirit of death comes, and it passes over all of the Israelite homes, but it enters into the homes that didn't do it. And one of those homes, really importantly, is Pharaoh's, and Pharaoh's oldest son dies. At this point, Pharaoh then says, "Fine, I'm done fighting your Hebrew God. He's more powerful than the Egyptian God. He is scarier, and he is clearly fighting for you or your people a lot stronger than the Egyptian gods are doing." So he says, you go, and they go out into the wilderness. And so Passover is that celebration of the freedom that was finally given to the Israelite people. But it came at a cost. It came at a cost of the sacrifice of a lamb and the death of the oldest born sons. And that's our first point. The temple is where the Passover is celebrated. A lamb is sacrificed. Jews from all over the land would come and celebrate there and worship God together for the freedom that was brought to them. And as we continue along in this Exodus story, we have the Jews who have been set free from Egyptian oppression, and they are in the wilderness, and they're wandering, and they wander for 40 years. And while they're in the wilderness, they're being led by Moses, and they're being led by God. And at some point, God says, "Moses, come up to a mountain, I'm going to give you a bunch of rules," and this is called the law, a Mosaic law. And these laws are to be holy, and holiness is really important to the Israelites. It's really important because God comes and dwells with them, and he comes and hangs out with them in this portable temple called the tabernacle. And to get close to God, you need to be holy, so you need to be without sin. And so to be without sin, you need to give a sacrifice. the sacrifice sort of takes upon your sin and it's offered to God, and you say, well, God, I'm trusting you with my best offering. And that's really important, that it's about the best offering possible. It could be grain, it could be an animal, it could be wine. And the most important thing about the offering is that it is the best offering. It's always the top, the creme de la creme. If it's anything less than that, it's actually offensive to God. And by doing this, by offering up the best offering and making that sacrifice to God, you are cleaned of your sin, you're cleaned of any impurity, any spiritual impurity that you have, and you are able to be closer to God. You're able to dwell closer in his presence and dwell with him. And that's at the tabernacle, but not necessarily the temple. We're not there yet. If we fast forward a really long way, 40 years later, the Israelites get to Jerusalem and they build the temple. And the temple then replaces the tabernacle. The temple is now the holiest of holies. It is where God is dwelling, and it's where all the sacrifices are being made. It's where people are being made clean and made holy again. The third point, God dwelling with his people. I've mentioned it a few times. And I've actually linked below to the Bible Projects video because it explains it much better than I could or will. In summary, the temple is built and mirrored off of the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is built and mirrored off of Eden. So all three of these places or structures, I guess Eden's not really a structure, but all three of these things symbolize God dwelling with his people in a very close relationship. That then brings the video to a close. That's why the temple is so important. It's where the Jews celebrate the freedom from slavery. It's where they celebrate being made holy. And it's where they celebrate God choosing to dwell with them. Another huge reason why this matters so much is because that Hebrew God that is having sacrifices made to, that is freeing his people from physical slavery, is the same God that the Christians worship. So how do we reconcile that? How do we balance the two together? And that is a question I absolutely love. I hope you guys enjoyed. Next time we're going to be looking at the Greek background to first century Jerusalem and a philosopher called Philo of Alexandria. I'll see you then.